Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Ealing Schools Forum. The first item on the agenda is the appointment of the chair. Mr. Paul Adair has been nominated unopposed for the position of chair for the current municipal year. And I'll now hand over to Judith Finlay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Cornelia. Yes, our thanks and appreciation to Paul Adair for taking on this role. But before we move on and allow Paul to chair, we'd just like to extend my thanks and the thanks of the whole school forum to Margaret Magunda, who's done a fantastic job chairing the school forum on all our behalf over a number of years. She's shown real skill and dedication and perseverance to make sure that we make the right budget decisions for all of our pupils and all of our schools. So just an acknowledgement from all of us, Margaret, of how much we appreciate all of your fantastic work. Thank you.
It's very kind of you to say that, Judith. I mean, I have appreciated, obviously, the great amount of help that I've had from you and Tamara and Gary over 9 years, I think. And I'm glad to hand it over to Paul.
We've kept you going a few extra seasons, I think, Margaret, so thank you. We appreciated your commitment to doing that. And we won't frighten Paul by saying that that's the same term that we're expecting from him.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I would also like to, just as I take up the chair of Ealing Schools Forum, just reinforce the comments that, or agree in support of the comments that Judith made about Margaret, and to say a big thank you on behalf of Ealing Schools Forum for the years of service and guidance. Thank you, Margaret. So the next item on the agenda is the appointment of the vice chair, and unless there's any nominations now, I think we'd like to ask the different representative groups to consider nominations to be put forward, and this issue to be brought up at the next schools forum, particularly amongst the secondary head and primary head group, if they could consider the vice chair role. So maybe, Cornelia, we can agree that as an action in the minute for nominations to be put forward as vice chair.
Yes, we can certainly do that. Thank you.
Unless there are any nominations now, we'll move on to the third item on the agenda, which is apologies. Cornelia, are there any apologies for absence?
Yes, we do have apologies from Councillor Charan Sharma, from Susan Stanley or Sue Stanley, from Claire Rees, from Emma Appleby, and from Dave Woods.
Thank you. Cornelia, just remind me, do we have to agree those absences, or is they just automatically registered?
No, they're just noted.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the fourth item on the agenda is anything urgent, any urgent matters? No? Okay. And then item 5 is matters to be considered in private. No? Any declarations of interest, item 6? Okay, moving on to item 7, then the minutes as a record, true record. First, can we agree that they are a record of the last forum meeting, and then any matters arising from that? Anybody want to bring up any matters? No? So we agree the minutes from the 28th of April. And then we can move on to school forum membership, item 8. Cornelia or Tamara, are there any issues around membership that you wanted to bring up?
Just to note, it's Cornelia here, just to note, since the last meeting in April, there's been 2 changes to the non-executive members of council. So Councillor Mann and Councillor Sharma have replaced, excuse me, I think Councillor Driscoll and, sorry, excuse me, the name of the other councillor has escaped me. But we have 2 new councillor members on the ESF since the last meeting in April.
So we can note that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And that brings us to the main body of the meeting, but I think we want to take the schools audit item first. Is that okay with you, Mike? Mike Pinder?
Great. Yep, no problem. Thank you. Do you want me to share the slides or?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful if that's
Right.
possible.
I'm more accomplished with Teams, so just let me see if I can. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. I can't do that, I'm afraid. Cornelia, are you able to share the slides or?
I'm going to enable you to do so.
Okay, brilliant.
Mike, could
Thank you.
you try again?
Yep.
Please. Oh. I think I'll share.
Mike, the slides are quite short in number, so if it's a problem getting them on screen, it's fine. I think for you just to talk through them briefly, people will have the papers in front of them.
Yep, no probs. This is I call it my annual nag. I'm going to have to think of some new jokes for next year, aren't I? So a reminder, really, this is a summary of sort of the findings that we do across the school. As I've probably mentioned before, a shared service between Ealing and Hounslow. We do benefit from having kind of similar findings across both authorities and the schools that we audit. A little bit of a disrupted year this year in terms of doing some of those, although we managed to complete most of the Ealing side schools. We are finding similar issues at a number of schools, and I was just going to very briefly run through those from the slides. If you want the detail, I can refer you back to last year's report, and we are also going to speak to the bursars, I think it is, group later in the summer. So we'll reiterate some of those messages there. So I'm keeping it fairly high level and short, but obviously if you have any questions or if any of you wish to get a bit more detail, I'm very happy to do that offline. So kind of the key themes are around governance, making sure that your governors have got regular access to financial training. Obviously, you'll probably have some who have significant experience and those kind of things, but making sure that they attend relevant training where possible. The second one is around budget monitoring reports, ensuring that they go to the appropriate bodies. The recommendation is 6 times a year, so every couple of months. Declaration of interest, just making sure that the register's kept up to date and that at meetings you do check for declarations of interest. And then the final point is just having access to the relevant financial expertise within the team that you have access to within your school, i.e. your bursars or admin or finance managers, making sure that those people are there to support you in those challenges. The next slide moves on to the kind of, I've called it school strategy area. So looking at the school development and improvement plans, making sure that those are in place. The other areas just around the business continuity disaster recovery plans, probably never so important as now. Just looking though at making sure you've got that stuff in place. So if your premises weren't available, for example, or if there was a catastrophic failure of IT systems, what would you do? And trying to think about that. And probably the most poignant and relevant one at the moment, if you had mass unavailability of staff, for example, for a pandemic, what would you do in those circumstances? So just kind of reiterating the need to try and make sure that you have got those business continuity disaster recoveries in place. The next slide is just around value for money. you know, just trying to make sure that you do the benchmarking that's available. That includes the staffing and SLT teams that you have. Head teachers pay, I'm sure you're all very conscious on that one, but just trying to make sure that you comply with the rules on that one for the size of your school and all those kind of things. Final point was just something I'm aware of happening at the moment. It's just around tendering and making sure that you do the appropriate tendering for services to try and secure the right value for money in the stuff that you procure for your schools. Moving to the next slide, which is just around protecting public funds. I'll smile nicely at Paul here because I know he's going to ask me about purchase orders and raising them in all circumstances. Obviously, we're trying to say try and raise them in advance. It should help you with your budgetary control. We are looking at the more material stuff. You know, we don't expect it for every single item, but trying to do that in advance, it helps you plan. Bank reconciliations, this is key. You should try and get these done monthly and then sign off by an appropriate officer, probably head teachers. This tries to help all income and expenditure is recorded, so when you come to your budget monitoring at the end, it's all there. It will also pick up things like check fraud, which I'm going to mention in a minute. Finally, the good old credit cards, just trying to make sure that those are reconciled regularly. If you as head teachers or deputy head teachers have them, try and make sure there's kind of a more senior level review, which may be going to your chair of the Board of Governors. I always kind of try and say this, it's about protecting yourselves as well. If there's ever an allegation or a concern raised or anything, the transparency and review and challenge that offers helps to protect yourselves as well. You know, unfortunately, it's never as easy to implement these things as to when there has been an irregularity. So just please do remember it's there to protect you. I know it can feel like a pain and a lot of review, but it's for your benefit. Moving on to the fraud risk slide. So I think there's some repetition here. Cyber and ransomware is an increasing threat. Those pesky emails where they try and sneak you to click on a link and those kind of things, or respond or make an urgent payment. You know, I'm sure most of you are alert to those, but they're getting more and more sophisticated. So please do watch out for those kind of emails, and don't click on anything if you're not sure. Check fraud still hovering. I know the number of checks people are utilising is reducing and probably forced by the pandemic and the difficulty of getting two signatories in the room. You're moving to electronic payments, but check fraud does seem to still happen, and people copying those, faking them, intercepting them, and those kind of things. And that's where your bank reconciliation can also pick up that a fraud has occurred to you. Supplier collusion. I think, you know, there's always a risk where you've got cozy relationships between members of your team and suppliers. So just keeping an oversight of those to make sure that it's operating in the way that you should expect periodically. It's just something else to be aware of. As always, we are here to give advice. We do have an investigation team, so if you do suspect a fraud or have a concern, please do contact us at fraud@Ealing. And we're happy to give you a little bit of advice. We'd rather you came to chat to us about something you're concerned about, and it turns out to be nothing, than coming to us later. Final slide is probably just to make you aware of a few changes from my team. We've looked to develop shorter audits. We've been round and done all the schools over the last 3 years, and this was always the plan. they'll be more focused, hopefully working with you, reducing the kind of level of input that you need to do. Where we identify maybe a concern on a transaction or something, we might extend the testing to give additional assurance. There will be, I'm sure you'll all be pleased to know, with tighter budgets, a reduced audit fee to reflect the reduced audit time. If there is any uncertainty, then we may click back to the fuller audit, and I'm afraid at that point you would probably be charged the full fee. And you can also ask for it from your side's perspective as well, if you think it would be useful. I know some of you are quite supportive and find the audit, a full audit, helpful, but we're hoping the new regime will give you the same level of assurance, just more bang for your buck. Over to you for any questions.
Thanks, Mike. Good note to end on. Everybody likes to hear about reduced fees, so that's a winner. Does anybody have any questions for Mike? Jeremy?
If I might, go ahead.
Hi, Mike. Sorry, my camera is struggling at the minute, but it's Jeremy from Three Bridges. I was going to ask about the long-term plan about continuing with remote audit process, because I wanted to say all of the schools that I work with have mentioned the work that your team has done over the last kind of 16 months or so, how you swiftly moved the process online, and how that's really reduced stress, anxiety, but kept a really thorough process in place for schools they found beneficial. And I just wanted to express my gratitude on behalf of my own school, but also the schools that I've spoken with about the audit process over the last 16 months, who have all felt very similarly. So thank you very much for swiftly responding to a crazy, unprecedented situation. And I'm really glad that you're planning on continuing to offer kind of both services, both the new approach and what would have been considered perhaps the old approach. And so thank you very much. And you've kind of answered my question in advance, I guess.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I mean, the remote working, I think what we'd say is we're kind of looking to continue that to a degree. We'd always like the caveat of coming in if we feel we need to see documentation directly. But you know, if it's working for you, and I think we're also conscious it does put more pressure on yourselves to scan stuff and provide stuff and whatever. But it's useful to have that feedback in considering our deliberations around that too. Thank you,
Ian.
Yeah, Mike, I was just intrigued, and I know that you're on top of the issues around fraud and so on, so I wasn't going to pick on that. I was interested in improvement plans and business continuity and so on, and whether you had needed to act in that area at all to make improvements flow through in any, obviously unnamed schools in this instance. Did you hear that all right?
I heard everything apart from the area that you're actually asking about.
It was about the school strategy, because it was an area that I hadn't really linked particularly, because I absolutely support, obviously, all the areas that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things that we regularly find and make recommendations. It's around the sorry, I'm just checking my notes. The plans for improvement and outcomes, and making sure it's viable. So it's really just making sure that goes to the governing body. We're finding that not everybody's necessarily done all the work that they need to do that, and it's about the kind of 3-year plans and those sort of things. So just reiterating the need to check that. I think it's probably hit and miss. People either do it very well or don't necessarily do it. So it's something that we find we're regularly recommending. Does that cover your question?
Yes, indeed. I think it's been such a sort of difficult time for schools to keep on a clear plan because of all the factors in play, and they've had to adapt so much. I think they've done, I suspect, a brilliant job in most cases. So that it's great to know that that's also been reviewed. Thanks, Mike. That was it.
Cool. Thank you.
So is there any other questions for Mike while he's here? No? Okay, thank you, Mike, for your presentation. That's really useful, and we'll let you go now. Enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you. Cheers all.
Take care, Mike.
Bye.
So moving on to the substantive part of the meeting around schools funding. Tamara, do you want to take us through the recommendations?
Yeah, sure. So Kim and I will probably tag team on some of this. So as many of you will know, this time of year is the point at which we look back over the last financial year, so 2021, look at the outturn of schools, the outturn of schools funding overall, and then start to look forward to the outturn of this year and the forthcoming national funding formula changes. So that's what the recommendations focus on. We also give Schools Forum a heads up on some of the decision making that will happen later on in the year. So Kim, do you want to kick off with the first few recommendations?
Yeah, okay, so the first recommendation is for Forum to note the level of school balances as well as the loan and deficit rate agreements. So the report sets out the current school balances, so the end of 2021 school balances. Appendix 1 sets out about the end of year balances for each school. In total, those balances total 22.1 million at 31st of March, which was an increase of 4.7 million on the previous year. And of the 77 Ealing maintained schools, 72 closed with a surplus balance and 51 increased their balance in year. On the 8 schools with excessive balances, so Appendix 1 sets out, is an extract from the scheme for financing schools and sets out the reasonable level of balances, suggested at 8% for nursery, primary and special schools and 5% of budget for high schools. The amount above that threshold represents, in Ealing maintained schools, represents 7.8 million. And it increased, that figure increased by 3.1 million in year. And so the full details of those balances are set out in Appendix 2, and there were 42 schools in total with an excess surplus balance, so above those thresholds of the 5% for secondary and 8% for primary, special and nursery schools. In terms of the deficits in total amount to just under £1 million. There are 5 schools in total with deficits at the end of 2021. One of those was a school that was previously in surplus, has fallen into deficit this year, and 2 schools came out of deficit and are back in surplus this year. So that sort of number in deficit has gone down from 6 to 5 this year. In terms of the other second recommendation, there is agreeing what action the Forum wish to take where schools have excess surpluses. So the report sets out the clawback mechanism that's within the scheme for financing schools. So the clawback mechanism is, well, the can be applied, so according to our school scheme, applied on balances for nursery primary schools above 9% and for secondary schools above 6%, and then there's incremental 5%, 10%, 15% levels that can be applied on the balance above that level. So looking at those balances, and I think the excess balance mechanism is would only be applied for schools who are in excess surplus and have been for the past 2 years and have had increasing surplus over the past 3 years. So last year, Forum did agree to apply the surplus balances mechanism, and that resulted in 10 schools being subject to a total of £155,000 clawback across all the 10 schools. Of those schools subject to clawback, 9 continue to have an excess balance, but 5 have reduced their balance in 2020-21, and so would no longer be subject to clawback under the proposed balance mechanism. Based on this year's balances, there's 13 schools that would potentially be subject to that mechanism. So 9 new schools and 4 that did experience clawback last year. And Appendix 3 sets out an illustration of the clawback values for those schools. So the decision for Schools Forum to consider is whether we get Forum minded to apply the clawback mechanism. So that would be agreeing the resultant clawback funds could then be used to support Hannay's pressures and other potential pressures related to the future school organisation changes. So using the same balance control mechanism as the previous year, as set out in the scheme, considering only those schools who have the increased surplus and excess surplus over the 3-year period, or option 2, that we Forum choose not to claw back the excess balances. So that's the decision for Forum to make. And then the report sets out the tasks that Schools Accountancy would take prior to processing the clawback. So there are a number of stages that including reviewing the school balances forms that accountancy would do before making the decision on the clawback for individual schools.
Thanks, Kim. Mia?
Hello, I just have a question on that, please, which is just to ask, how will the clawback mechanism ensure that schools whose balances might increase during the year, particularly during the last 2 years, where there's been an unexpected increase in funding as a result of some of the COVID funding from government? So how will we ensure that those schools are not disadvantaged, please?
Kim or Tamara? Did you want to respond? Yeah.
Sure. So schools will be sent a letter notifying them of the clawback, and we'll look at the paperwork that we have already in place, and that will set out some of those commitments that schools might have. And then there's an opportunity, a time period for heads to come back to the council to discuss the clawback and the pressures that might cause. So in previous years, the vast majority of schools have not come back to the LA to express concern about clawback, putting them into financial difficulty. We have had, each year a couple of schools where there have been extended conversations and consideration of the value of the clawback. So it allows for that process to take place.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tamara. Any other questions for Tamara, Kim?
Presumably, yeah, it's Ian. Sorry, Tamara and Kim. Presumably, the schools that are on the list, the 14, I think it is, or 13, must be quite well aware already that they, because every school knows the percentage limits. I mean, they might not be expecting to be asked to have that recovered from them, but they must be aware of it. And the fact, as I mentioned previously, that the fact it's over 3 years just makes me think that we put a lot of safeguards in here, and it would be quite difficult, I would have thought, to defend a position after 36 months. 36 months of balances going in the direction that they were going. Do we expect? I think Tamara, you're saying probably isn't going to be a lot of pushback based on past experience, but.
Well, the push when there is pushback, it can be quite vociferous. But in terms of the numbers that do push back, it's in small number. So a small number of those that are that receive the clawback. There've only been over the last 2 years a couple of cases where there's been an exceptional capital circumstance. So we've clawed that money back and held it aside for a specific programme of work. But in the other occasions there have been commitments that we've continued to claw back because of exactly what you've set out, Ian. Yeah,
I mean, it feels as though there are a lot of safeguards within the text of the document that you've shared with us here, Tamara, that suggests that every opportunity for it to not be clawed back would be provided. But yeah, I'm happy on that basis that we would let you as a team decide which ones finally should be clawed back or not. And this is the starting point of that process.
Thanks, Ian. So unless there are any other questions, one of the proposed ways forward was by the end of the term, if we do agree it, that any further ideas on top of the returning it to the high needs block would be communicated to Tamara or Kim. There had been discussion around some consultancy. I know there'd been discussion around the No Learner project. So any ideas before the end of term to Kim or to Tamara. But we do need to agree or not this. So I guess the best way to do this, if anybody doesn't agree, to state that. Otherwise, haven't had an extensive discussion about it. Shall we agree to apply the balance control mechanism? No objections? Yeah. There's a few ticks and thumbs up. Yeah, great. Super. Yeah, so I think we can agree to apply the balance control mechanism in its form as outlined. Thank you. So moving on then, Tamara, to the third point, national funding formula.
Yeah, so I think Kim will take us really briefly through the next few, because you'll have had a chance to read through the report. So Kim, if you want to, do you want to take item 3 and 4?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on the on the national funding formula, so there's not much change this year. The formula is government confirmed that the formula will remain a soft formula for 2022-23, and therefore will continue to be determined locally. They have committed to consulting on how they move forward to the hard funding formula in the coming months. Don't yet have a sort of time frame for that, but that will hopefully come in the coming months. And then the local authority will follow the usual timetable to consult schools in the autumn term on the funding arrangements for the following year across all the blocks. The report sets out that timetable, which is following the timetable we've followed in previous years. And then Forum are just asked to note that update and consider some of the key decisions in relation to the formula. So those are some of the key decisions that will need to be made in the autumn term, November meeting, regarding the premises growth and minimum funding guarantee, and also to remind Forum the Ealing that moved to fully funding, to funding fully on the national funding formula in 2021-22. So the sort of move to a hard formula wouldn't be a significant change from what we currently are doing. So are there any comments on or questions on that section? Can't see anyone coming in. Okay, so then the next section is about the funding decisions that need to be made for 22-23. So Forum are required to vote and approve a range of deallocated and central budget decisions. So the discussion around that and some of the agreement will start in the November meeting and then to be finished and agreed in the January meeting. So to assist in our planning, at this meeting, we're just seeking Forum on whether we're seeking feedback on whether Forum are minded to continue to fund the service budget. So Appendix 4 sets out the education functions dedelegation and central schools block retained duties as they were in 21-22. So we'd welcome feedback from Forum as to whether they're minded to continue or considering any changes to those. And then the historic commitment. So the historic commitment grant for 21-22 was reduced by 20%, and we envisage them maybe similar decreases or continued decreases to that budget going forward. So the historic commitment budget for 21-22 is set out in table 2 of the report. So any kind of comments on that, and if there was a further decrease in funding, where Forum members would be minded for that to come that reduction to be made.
Any comments? I think they're pretty, Kim, I think it's a question of whether they remain the same or they're dwindling. So it's not that the issue is about any increases. So I think it's pretty standard. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And shall we move? Anybody, any comments?
The main thing for us is if there's a strength of feeling to either cease or substantially reduce any of the budgets that affect the council, really helpful to know at an early stage, because that will affect the consultation that happens at the beginning of the autumn term before the next forum. So that's the purpose of this, and just a reminder to you all of the main decisions you'll be making.
Anybody got any views, comments? So I think we can take it as noted in this meeting that there aren't any particular views and any substantive changes to that.
Sorry, can I just ask Tamara or Kim, are these 4 items and historical commitments will have to be paid for in some shape or form? Is it just where the funding comes from that's the issue, or is it that they would have to be scaled back and actually not incurred at the levels they've been historically incurred at?
So there would be either scaling back or cessation of those services, and they'd either become traded or they'd cease to be available to schools. So that's the kind of the reality of scaling them back. They directly fund posts and services.
As the largest item is high needs, transfer to high needs too, which is a difficult area already without a further dent in its funding. Okay, thanks for that.
Okay, Kim or Tamara, do you want to take us to item 5 or on this early years funding?
So the early years block, there's not a huge amount to update forum on that. The Ealing has maintained its funding rate since April 2019. There hasn't been any change in that. It has been a challenging year for the early years sector, and challenging from a financial point of view because there have been considerable changes in terms of the headcounts which feed into their funding. So the government have moved from a position where funding is all based on the spring term counts to a termly collection of that information, which was a positive change for us because in Ealing and across a lot of the country, numbers were considerably down in the January, but it does lead to a bit more uncertainty about the levels of funding this year than we would normally have at this time of year. So the updates to the early years funding allocation will be published later in the summer term. We are expecting some level of clawback because of the drop in headcount. I'm not expecting a further change from the government in terms of the funding rate, but the funding block allocations are likely to change due to those termly collections throughout the year. So the forum will be updated as we know more of the sort of implications of that.
And Kim, can I just ask, in terms of the consultation in the autumn term around the funding formula, will the early years funding formula be part of that consultation?
Occasionally they run separately. Because the timing doesn't, the timing for the early years is up till Christmas for the consultation, and the timing for the main school funding is up to the beginning of November, because there are different appeals processes for the two. So we try to dovetail them into one another.
Okay.
And just to remind forum members that the key decision in this year for you later in the year that affects the LA is the 5% that's allowed to be centrally retained to deliver the early years services. So that's the key decision for forum in relation to early years. Okay.
Thanks. And then any questions on that? Okay, on item 6 then, Kim?
Sure. Tamara's going to take this
one. Yeah, so we've given a brief update on high needs. There was some more substantial information in the April report. So this is really to remind you, as you all probably are well aware, that continue to be pressures in relation to high needs, continued growth in education, health and care plan numbers, and the impact of COVID on young people and the costs to the council through the high needs block is still working its way through, and it's not entirely clear how that's going to impact long term. So that's something that we're working on over the course of the summer term, and we'll have a more detailed update for Forum in the November meeting. The key decision for Forum later this year is that whether to continue the 0.5% transfer from the schools block over to the high needs block. So clearly we'll consult with all schools on that. It's probably important to note that should schools decide to not transfer that funding, there is a process for local authorities to appeal that process, and that's why the consultation needs to take place before a certain time, because there are timeframes around that. It's not to suggest we necessarily will, but it's just to be aware that there is that mechanism in place. So really it's just a note, and then to ask Schools Forum if there's kind of any early indication that might not be agreed or substantially reduced. It would be helpful to know that at an early stage.
Anybody want to comment on that item?
Sorry, me again. Tamara, is 0.5% the upper limit, or is and all the risk is downside, or is there potentially scope? Because I mean, a lot of schools are impacted by funding for high needs block, I guess. So there's widespread support, but is 0.5 the top, or is it?
Yeah, so 0.5 is the top, and this is just the continuation. So it doesn't escalate by 0.5% every year. It's just a continuation of what's already been agreed. So I think it works out to about 1.2 million. So 0.5% is the upper limit. That's likely to be one of the key things that the national funding formula, the implementation of the hard formula would need to be considering, because some boroughs transfer either all of the 0.5% or part of it or none of it. So that means that there's not a consistent national approach. So and so that is a decision firmly that sits with schools and with the Forum.
Okay, so I think that there's, aside from what I can see, no indication that there would be any objection to that. So I think we'll read that as it is. Moving on to number 7.
So number 7 is again a decision to be taken at this meeting. So each year we set out the outturn position for the Dedicated Schools grant across the different blocks. And Schools Forum asked to agree the use of reserves, any reserves that might remain at the end of that period. So the report sets out the reduced deficit between years on high needs cumulatively. So the deficit's reduced from just over 3 million to just under 2 million between years. A large part of that is linked to the use of reserves that was agreed the previous year. The early years block surplus, as Kim set out, lots of uncertainty around headcounts and clawback, so there remains a reserve for early years at the end of the year. And then the schools block schools block and central school services grant, that service surplus relates to previous years' growth fund underspends largely. So what the LA is proposing Schools Forum considers is continued use of those reserves to offset high needs funding pressures, as well as school organisation changes. And those changes they're not reorganisations within schools of staffing, they're reorganisations of school establishments, so schools that close, schools that amalgamate, etc. So it's linked to that wider scale change rather than operational school organisation changes. So that's the proposal. Are there any questions linked to that proposal?
I think my colleagues are very well behaved this evening. So shall we, is it opportune to agree that action or that recommendation? Without any objections, I presume that we will agree it. Yes, good. Rachel's at least gives a thumb up. Yeah. Thank you. Marion's nodding. So yeah, we'll agree that.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Jamie. And then moving on to number 8, just to note the DSG outturn.
Yeah, absolutely, to note the outturn, and probably the main thing to highlight in the outturn, although you know, the Hannay's block position is quite a challenging position nationally, and it is a real challenge in Ealing for both schools and the local authority. Actually, the deficit didn't escalate substantially between years because of a lot of the work that's been put in between, you know, schools and the local authority working collaboratively together to continue to provide really high quality provision. So Ealing's position compared to a number of other neighbouring boroughs is reasonably strong. We have had direct contact from the Education Schools Funding Agency because of the Hannay's deficit, and they're working much more closely with boroughs now, and there's much more scrutiny from them in making sure that boroughs are really on top of their deficit recovery planning. You may or may not have heard that some boroughs have been needed to have had quite extensive support from central government. That's a rare occurrence, but they're very focused on this area at the moment. It's something that we're working through over the course of this year.
Yeah, I think that's really worth noting, Tamara, that Ealing as a local authority, the collaboration between schools and the council has really been, you know, in comparison to what some other areas have had to experience recently and what's been in the news. I think all credit due to that collaboration and managing a very difficult and complex pot of money. So I would just like to agree with Tamara on that. It's not an easy, particularly the high needs budget, it's not an easy block to manage. So I think that, unless anybody's got any comments, brings us to the end of the meeting.
Almost, Paul.
Almost.
Not quite the end of the meeting. I think there's an item 10 on the agenda around virtual.
Oh, virtual, that's right. Sorry, Tamara, you're right. What is the upshot on the virtual meetings? Who wants to?
I can cover that if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so schools forum regulations have changed to include the continued use of virtual meetings to conduct the forum meetings. So really it was to just flag that for the local authority, the November meeting conflicts with Cabinet, and we're unable to conduct the meeting in person because of that. We only have facility to conduct one virtual meeting at a time. So we'd be asking Forum to agree for the November meeting to be virtual. And we are proposing that Forum can consider continuing that for the rest of the municipal year. So that would include the January and April meetings. However, you know, that's open to you know, consideration to the Forum. So we're asking to note that the November meeting will be virtual and then consider the rest of the year.
So just to be clear, Tamara, you mentioned their conflict with the Cabinet meeting. So is the proposed virtual meeting on the 10th of November?
So you could consider agreeing that all meetings will now be virtual, but that's for Forum to consider and discuss.
But the next one?
We're asking that we're almost asking you to note that the next one will need to be virtual.
Yes, but what I'm asking is there a change of date from the Wednesday, the 10th of November?
No.
It's on the Wednesday, the 10th of November.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't understand the question. Does anyone have, so it's really to seek views, so not about the November, because that will need to be virtual, but thinking about the rest of the municipal year.
And that can still be broadcast through the mechanism we've used tonight.
Yeah, they will need to be.
Even though there's a clash. Yeah.
So
the Cabinet and Schools Forum can go side by side and both.
I think I've confused the whole thing, Ian. Cornelia?
Yeah, yes.
Sorry, could you
Hello.
rescue me from the mistake that I can feel that I've made? Sorry.
Good evening. With the November meeting, actually, it's the facility to have 2 in-person meetings and broadcast both. So Cabinet is going to be in person in November, and that can be broadcast, but we don't have the facility to also broadcast Ealing Schools Forum with Cabinet if Ealing Schools Forum is in person. So Ealing
can
School
be if it's virtual.
And Cornelia,
it
could I just ask, are any of the councillors that are school forum members have to attend the Cabinet meeting that night?
I don't believe they do. I mean, we've got 2 of our councillor members here. I don't believe they do have to attend the Cabinet meeting.
Okay.
I mean, do you want me to answer that?
Thanks, David.
The constitution of Ealing Schools Forum is that executive members of the council can't be, i.e. Cabinet members, can't be members of Schools Forum. So by definition, we don't need to be. I sometimes attend Cabinet, and I suppose other councillors do, but so they are mutually exclusive.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
Jeremy?
Judith was going to come in.
I think Jeremy was just before Judith.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to voice my concern over every meeting being virtual. After 16 months of everything being online, I cannot handle an entire year again of just virtual meetings. I can understand the efficiencies and with all of the timetables that are in this meeting, how challenging it can be to get people to come together. But I would appreciate if there was a balanced approach to, the meetings being in person, virtual. So maybe a mixture of, on again, off again, or something like that.
I do have to say, in relation to what Jeremy says, I do really recognize the efficiency, and certainly in the November meeting, but it does, I find in my experience that virtual meetings do limit the amount of discussion that a purposeful meeting could have. So I would have to say that I would be of the same view. Judith, were you going to come in?
I was going to come in just to say what David has said, but he covered it more eloquently than I could have. We can hear people being interested in having face-to-face meetings, because I agree with you, it does facilitate a better conversation. Why don't we take a straw poll outside the meeting, so we accept that November has to be virtual, but that we take a view in the autumn about the following 2 meetings.
Sure, good idea.
Thank you.
Can we note that, Cornelia?
Yes, we can.
One follow-up question, thinking not about November, but going forward. Presumably, a good option, but actually an impractical one, would be to have a mixed format, which would be to have people who wish to be in the room, but to have a virtual element for those who didn't. I suspect that's not going to fly, but I thought I'd mention it anyway.
Yeah. Sorry, Judith.
No, go on, Tamara. You're going to say the same thing, I think.
Oh, I was going to say, so through the regulations that is possible. What I would say is that technically we've really struggled to deliver those types of meetings successfully. So while that might be a solution in the future, I think we're not quite in that position now.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just thought I'd mention it to make sure that was the thanks.
It is possible to do that.
If I can contribute to that, we are in fact trialing a hybrid meeting tomorrow for the overview and scrutiny committee. So it's still very new. We're still sort of finding our feet with that, with the hybrid meetings. So
David,
we'll
thanks,
see how it
Cornelia.
goes.
David? Yeah, I was just going to confirm that. In fact, I'm going to a meeting tomorrow afternoon where we're just going to trial the trial. So, but in full council will be hybrid, which is on the 20th of July. So that will be hybrid, as I understand it. But because the council meetings formal council to make decisions have to be in person. The legislation has reverted back, but as I understand it, and somebody can correct me, but Ealing Schools Forum is under different legislation and they can be held virtually. But I have to say, I'd rather they were in person, the same as others were saying.
Margaret?
Thanks. I'm sorry, I can't work out how to put my hand up on that yellow one, but it seems to me that from the point of view of a governor on this committee, it's useful to have meetings in person, because obviously the heads meet together on other occasions, but the governors don't necessarily meet other members of the forum. And it seems to me useful to be able to have conversations in the forum. But you don't have to take any notice of me, because I won't be any.
No, it's a point well made, Margaret, and a very valid point, so thank you. Rachel?
Sorry, I've actually quite often thought about, I'm sorry to have to say this, but I cannot remember what the name of that room is where we've met the last few times. Is it the cabinet room? I don't have a clue.
I think it was the council chamber.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that sounds familiar. In that room, what would make it possible to have a hybrid is the fact that everybody have their own microphones, which is usually the problem when you have a hybrid. You can't hear the people who are in the room if you are online and the others are not. I was in a meeting like that the other day, and unless the microphone is facing someone, you can't hear what they're saying. But in that room, I actually thought, I've always thought of that room and thought that's the perfect place to have a hybrid, because each individual person has a microphone.
Thanks, Rachel. Well, we certainly can take all those ideas forward, and I think there is a sort of growing consensus to have some sort of in-person meet, perhaps for the January meeting, but the November meeting will definitely be on the 10th of November, Tamara, and it'll be virtual.
We couldn't get the date moved, so yes.
Okay, unless anybody's got any final comments, I think we can draw the meeting to a close, and enjoy your leisurely TV watching this evening.
Oh, right.
Thank you.
Thanks very much,
all.
everybody.
Bye now.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye, thank you.
Bye. Thank you.